Well, coming up, South Africa has been grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force. In news further afield, Nigerians are heading to the polls. A very good afternoon. If you've just joined us, we are live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, and you're watching The Week in Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. We're taking a look at some of those big stories that have made headlines and kept South Africa talking. Let's take a look at what we can expect this far. Speaking of which, our top story this hour, South Africa has been put on the grey list by the Financial Action Task Force. This means the country will be under increased monitoring regarding actions against money laundering, terrorist financing and proliferation financing. Grey listing also means the country has committed to resolve the deficiencies within the agreed timeframes.
The State Capture Commission of Inquiry put South Africa under scrutiny by the Financial Action Task Force, the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. This move was put in place to get the country to implement standards that could prevent money laundering and terrorism financing. On Friday, FATF announced that it has placed the country in the grey list, along with Nigeria. The two countries are Africa's biggest economies. However, in a statement, the global financial watchdog says South Africa has made significant progress on many of its recommendations to improve its systems. National Treasury says, although the country is placed on this list, the impact of it will not be significant.
In our case, the impact, I suspect, will not be very significant because FATF has acknowledged to what extent we've addressed many of the issues. And as long as the period is short, I think that, we could deal with some of the consequences. But like you say, for the continent, I think it's something that we do need to assess.
Analysts say since the announcement was made, the rand has been under pressure.
This is certainly not good news for South Africa, and I can see that the rand is under a lot of pressure this afternoon. But additional to that, I've just learned that the Americans are proposing to reconsider their relationships with South Africa. And I think that is a contributing reason why the rand is under pressure at the moment.
Small businesses are already finding it hard to access the market, and they say with the country finding itself on the grey list, they fear things will be much more difficult.
It's going to be a bit of a challenge because, when we talk about access to markets, access to exports, it's going to put extra burden on entrepreneurs who we are trying to say, if you're struggling to get a market locally, look outside.
This is reiterated by research analysts.
If you are an importer and exporter, the amount of paperwork that you would need to prove your sources of funding or the goods that you're moving, as just one example, will become a little bit more laborious and onerous. At the same time, I think it's just a reflection of the fact that how the rest of the world has to engage with us has to be at an increased or enhanced level of diligence.
On the other hand, the Banking Association says clients may rest assured that their business with the banks will not be affected.
With extra monitoring that comes with grey listing, there is that impact that it starts distracting, taking away from the good name of South Africa. What it means for clients of the banks, it really doesn't change many things because cross-border payments will still go on.
At the same time, economists say whether or not the country may be lifted from the grey list lies solely on government.
I do believe the government is capable of doing it, but whether there will be the political will to do so remains to be seen, because we have been seeing over the last few months how endemic the aspect of corruption and the absence of law and order in this country has been. to deal with many of these issues. So one has to conclude that even though it is quite possible to get out of grey listing in a fairly short space of time.
The watchdog identified 12 key findings and recommendations required to strengthen the South African financial system. It cited state capture, money laundering risks, law enforcement, and judicial capacity as some of the key areas needing attention. South Africa was given a year to report on the demonstrated progress that it has made to achieve the recommendations set out in the 2021 report. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, Eskom says it has seen changes in demand patterns with high consumption of power in certain areas. The General Manager for Engineering at Eskom, Thomas Conradi, says that they have not yet introduced stage 7 or 8 load shedding and would notify the public if forced to do so. Eskom was briefing the media at the weekly Government Communication Energy Action Plan update, where it says that the system is currently stable and that stage 6 will be maintained well into the weekend.
I need to state it clearly that we have not introduced stage 7 or stage 8 or any higher stages of load shedding. In managing the supply and demand, when we run out of options on the supply side, we need to manage the demand, and that is how we keep the system in balance. And there are various levers in which we can use to manage demand, of which one is load shedding, as we are all but too well known of. There's also what we refer to as load curtailment. That's where we've got specific contracts with some of our larger industrial customers, where we then have contracts with them that we can, when load curtailment is introduced, we can then also shed them from a certain time period, and that can actually run indefinitely until the point that we then lift that curtailment.
Well, SACP General Secretary Solly Mapaila has also hit out at former Eskom Group CEO Andre de Ruyter, where Mapaila says that since he was at the helm of the ailing power utility, load shedding has worsened. The alliance partner wants law enforcement authorities to investigate whether de Ruyter had any knowledge of corruption activities at Eskom. Mapaila made these comments following a meeting between the leadership of the Tripartite Alliance and a delegation from Cuba at Luthuli House. Now, the alliance will host an Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference later this year.
The governing party and its alliance partners hosted a Cuban delegation at its headquarters in Johannesburg. The alliance has a strong-standing historical friendship with the Latin American country, which aided in accelerating the fall of the apartheid government in South Africa and Namibia in 1988 with the Battle of Cuto Canavale. The SACP says South Africa has not adequately learned to protect its revolution. Mapaila says that this failing is evident by the recent events involving the former Eskom CEO, Andre de Ruyter. He says Cuba can teach a country how to ensure that it deploys the right people to take its development further.
He goes on an offensive to attack our country after himself has dismally shown what one may characterize as a spectacular failure in leading Eskom. Spectacular failure. I think when he came into office, practically, Eskom had an energy availability factor of about 70%. He let it down to where we are.
The alliance will later this year host the Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference. Both countries have collaborated in many sectors, including healthcare.
It is in this context that the ANC-led Tripartite Alliance has taken a decision to host the African leg of the Solidarity Conference of ICAP in support of the Cuban people. We are doing this as the ANC to signify our support and solidarity with the Cuban people. We will campaign, we will march, we will picket going forward to signify our support for the total liberation of the Cuban people.
South Africa and Cuba maintain strong bilateral relations. Natasha Piri, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, so we'll continue with more news and updates upon our return. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Hello, welcome back. You're watching the Week in Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. So, big story this week. We saw reactions coming through on the back of South Africa being grey listed. And we're going to take a look at the meaning of this, perhaps its implications as well as other economic stories that made headlines this week. Dr. Azwi Fanelini-Mushungwa, economics lecturer at the University of Venda, standing by to give some analysis. Dr. Azwi, good afternoon. Thank you for your time in the SABC. All right, so it seems that we're having some technical issues. You are joining us via hybrid. I'm going to start with my first question. All right, so perhaps the conversation continues as soon as we get Dr. Azwi Fanelini-Mushungwa back on the line, economics lecturer at the University of Venda. So she was weighing in on the back of the budget speech that took place, the state of the province. We also are going to look at the impact that the grey listing is now going to have in South Africa and the criteria that we will have to meet within the specified time frame in order to be upgraded. So perhaps as we try to get her back in the line, there really have been other stories making headlines this week, staying with the issue of the energy crisis and perhaps what's happening at the power utility. We've seen that with load shedding now reaching critical proportions in the country yet again, finding alternative energy sources are now being explored. So currently, only 5% of South Africa's electricity is generated by nuclear power. So while plans are currently underway to increase our nuclear power generation capacity, this will be a long-term solution to the energy problems.
It's not a question of making a decision of we're building or not. It's a question of when, the decision of when do we start the process, because the South African government has got its energy plan, the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, which makes room for 2,500 megawatts for nuclear. However, the process is building up to ultimate procurement have really been long drawn out, partly because of the mistakes that were done during the 9.6 gigawatt project that was so-called Russian project that President Zuma's cabinet was procuring from Russia, and the subsequent court overruling of that deal. A lot of caution now had to be adopted in moving, and that caution has led to, I would say, undue delays, to the extent that a lot of even serious contenders that would have probably invested in this program have decided it's not going to happen. For example, the Chinese company called State Nuclear Power and Technology Company, SNPTC, was had offices in Sandton. They had a big contingent of staff here because they were waiting for government to decide so that they can put a bid. They have relocated today. They are no longer they don't have offices in Sandton anymore because the project is moving slow. Now it is going to be slower because of the economic situation, because you need money. Even if you can get serious investors from outside, but government must put some guarantees in place. And with a battered economy that we have now because of COVID, one, and secondly because of load shedding, it will be a tall order at this point.
So back to our previous story, for some reaction on South Africa being grey listed, as well as some of the other economic stories making headlines. Dr. Azwi Fanelini-Mushungwa, economics lecturer at the University of Venda. Let's try your line once again. Good afternoon. Thank you for your time here at the SABC.
Afternoon, and the viewers outside.
All right. So we're obviously looking at the reactions coming through in the back of South Africa, having now been grey listed. And I wonder how you'd weigh in on how difficult it's going to be doing business in South Africa. Obviously, investor confidence is also going to be taking a knock with the recent developments. How would you weigh in on the back of that?
Number one, the issue that South Africa has been grey-listed, it's not good news to the country and the economy as a whole, for the fact that when the country is grey-listed, so the possibility that sectors like, number one, we have a problem when it comes to external financing options, meaning that there will be a constraint. So because of the fact that now our country is seen by outsiders that this is not a good economy or country to invest in. So possibility is that when we try to come up with maybe getting some finance from outside, it won't be easy. Number two, the grey listing issue also affects the cost of doing business, meaning that when South Africans want to do business, especially with the international world, automatically that now there is a negative attitude towards the country that has been grey listed. The possibility is that we find that now when we try to do business, we are at higher cost. And then thirdly, the third factor is that when one wants to send funds outside the country, a possibility that when it's transacted against the send funds, and then there will be problems that we find that now some banks are not accept any transaction from a country that has been visited. And last, it also affects the issue of foreign investment. For the fact that now we are seeing a country that is not a good investment destination, automatically the confidence will decline. Automatically that's the relationship on our foreign direct investment.
Dr. Azwi, we are struggling to hear you clearly on the line. I wonder if you could just perhaps pull the device a little further from you. We're going to see if it improves. But on the back of what you've just echoed, I wonder, what are the chances of ratings agencies perhaps also, using this as a means to impact the outcome of, what they have to say? I'm asking this also on the back of whether you think the government is capable of meeting the criteria within the specified frame to rectify the problem.
So there is a possibility that the country will be downgraded, but the impact may not be so massive. A thing that the government is trying all efforts to try to reduce or narrow the budget deficit. So we're trying to live within the budget, which means that when those credit rating agencies want to downgrade us, they also consider that South Africa is doing what it can to come up with fiscal consolidation. So we can say that though it may happen, it won't have massive effect on the economy.
Dr. Azwi, another big talk that preceded the announcement of South Africa being grey-listed is the budget speech by our Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana. And what did you make of the budget speech? There have been some mixed reactions, as always, from various industries and analysts.
I think the budget speech was good, saying that the Minister of Finance had attempted to strike a balance between spending priorities and the limited resources available to the national treasury. Though there may be some criticism that he hasn't said a mouthful, but I believe he has done his best to come up with a budget that will be so balanced. For the fact that we've seen that this year, they tried to reduce spending, and also the issue of trying to work within the budget that the government has. So we can say it was a good speech, if one has to say that.
The budget deficit was also reported to be smaller than last year's medium-term budget policy statement, narrowing further by 3.3% expected by 2025. That seems to be some good news on that front for the country.
Yes, when we have a decrease in the budget deficit, it simply means that the country is now spending less. And that also sends a positive message to credit rating agencies. Like I mentioned earlier, that if there is a commitment to reduce the budget deficit, so it simply means that as time goes on, especially when we are trying to make a forecast up to 2025, so it shows that government's commitment to reduce spending in South Africa, trying to also to reduce debt. So that becomes a good news to the economy of the country of South Africa.
So it's not all doom and gloom. Another factor that came out was the National Treasury forecasting the GDP growth for 2023 at 0.9%. The Reserve Bank forecasting it at 0.3%. So with that 0.6% difference, how would you weigh in on that? Is there concern regarding government's perhaps more overly optimistic outlook on the growth of the economy?
So the issue of making an over-optimism is a problem because when the government is making that a forecast which is a little bit higher as far as economic growth is concerned, So it is sending a negative message to say that we are on the right platform. There's not much that we need to work on. Because if we continue to do that, we come up with an over-optimism or optimistic budget forecast. So at the end of the day, it may reflect in the contraction of the economic growth in the long run. Possibility is that within maybe 2 or 3 years, we will see the impact of this over-optimism, so which is not good.
Dr. Azwi, there are micro conditions we have to monitor, also macro conditions. So we'll have to leave the conversation there, but I want to thank you for your time, for weighing in, already helping us to unpack what transpired this week on the back of Finance Minister Enoch Godongwada's budget speech. Also, news of South Africa being grey-listed as a country. Dr. Azwi Faneli Nemushunga is a lecturer, economics lecturer at the University of Venda. So thank you to you for your time. Well, moving further afield, we've seen news making headlines on the continent. Voters in Africa's biggest economy and most populous country, Nigeria, head to the polls today to elect a new president and lawmakers in what is set to be a close contest amid rising frustration over cash and fuel shortages, unprecedented insecurity and surging inflation. President Muhammadu Buhari, who will compete his constitutionally allowed 2 terms in May, is not on the ballot. Voters will also choose new senators, members for the House of Representatives. So travel restrictions on the movement of vehicles have been placed. Political analysts say that Nigerian election is crucial to Africa so that the continent's pride and dignity can be restored should Nigeria get everything right. Right, so it was a busy week for the international news team this week. The world over observed 1 year since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. The world also celebrated 20 years since PEPFAR was launched. On the continent today, Nigerians are voting in a very huge election in Africa, as well as the announcement of the grey listing of both Nigeria and South Africa by the Financial Act Task Force, the FATF. There is still reaction on the two large. There are still reactions coming through on this basis on the 2 largest economies in Africa. So, with all that said and done, to unpack this, we're going to be joined by SABC International News Editor Sophie Mokoena for more. A very good afternoon to you, Sophie. Thank you for joining us. The big talker today, Nigeria elections. Perhaps you can give us the latest on what's transpiring as they get head to the polls.
Well, voting started in different parts of Nigeria. As you pointed out, you're talking about more than 90 million eligible voters in that country, with the population way above 200 million. And therefore, in terms of logistics, it is a nightmare. And therefore, all eyes are on the Electoral Commission in that country. We saw the presidential candidates going to the polls, and it is a very tight race, but the continent is watching, the world is watching. The United States of America was first to issue a statement a few weeks ago, pointing out that they will be watching elections and wishing Nigerians well when they go to the polls. Yesterday, the European Union, and also in South Africa, the African National Congress, and also the government of South Africa watching elections because of the relations between the 2 countries, particularly because ANC is the governing party. But earlier on, the EFF leader, Julius Malema, in fact, a few minutes ago, our colleagues and other colleagues in the industry did ask him about the elections in Nigeria. Let's take a listen at what Malema had to say, because this is a very, very important exercise on the continent, as you pointed out, at a time where both South Africa and Nigeria were grey-listed. Let's listen to Malema.
Nigerians to elect the best man, the best woman for the job. They must make sure that this is done in a very peaceful manner. The outcomes of the elections should never be a source of picking up guns and creating violence in that beautiful country of Nigeria. We wish them well. We are with them. And we have confidence in Nigeria that it will do the right thing. It is one of the biggest economy in Africa. And once it gets into trouble, then the whole continent will get into trouble. They must know that when they vote in Nigeria, they must hold with them the thoughts of the African continent, that on their shoulders stand this beautiful continent, and they must inspire confidence that Africa can hold elections in a big country without a single drop of blood.
Of course, for South Africa, it is a big story, but also in terms of President Cyril Ramaphosa. As you know, that over the weekend, he was elected the chairperson of Peace and Security Council on the continent by the AU leaders. And therefore, I'm sure where he is, he's watching so that he can have a report in terms of issues related to security in that country. And he is expected to report back to his peers when there's a meeting of the AU summit later in the year. And I think he is watching, much as he's got a lot of work to do, because we know that there's this pending cabinet reshuffle. But Nigeria's story is a huge story on the continent and around the world.
Sophie, you have spoken about the impact of these elections on the continent, the world watching as Nigerians head to the polls. And another big story that's been topical this week is the issue of both South Africa and Nigeria being grey-listed being grey-listed. And I just wonder if you can briefly tell us, what the reaction has been from both countries. We've seen reactions coming through on multiple fronts, but also given the time frame to rectify this problem, how is this also going to impact dynamics on the international front for both countries?
Well, South Africa, the Minister of Finance did issue a statement acknowledging, and clearly he was expecting this, because during the week he gave an indication. And also the presidency reacted to this. You know that South Africa is part of this institution that looks at these illicit financial flow and also corruption. Mm-hmm. And therefore, South Africa sits in this committee. And therefore, South Africa was fully aware what's likely to happen. And they were requested a year ago to look at the issues that are related to illicit financial flows out of South Africa. And therefore, you'd recall that when Janet Yellen visited the country early last month at the game farm, she spoke about this and using an example of the industry, game farm industry, and the issue of rhino horns, illicit trade, that they can contribute towards illicit financial flows, particularly this money being sent out to insurgents and terror groups outside South Africa. You know that at some point in time last year, the United States of America did raise this issue at the Security Council, where they pointed out that there are some people who are using South Africa, as transit, but also in terms of illicit financial flows to support the insurgents or the so-called terror groups on the continent. And therefore, South Africa was warned, and also the financial institutions were warned. The same with the Reserve Bank responded yesterday. And therefore, South Africa, I think, is ahead of this challenge in a sense that, even in Parliament, there was a bill before Parliament that looks at tightening the processes to ensure that you don't experience this problem. And we know that it is before the president. I don't know whether the president has signed that bill into law, and I think it's part of the steps that South Africa is taking. On Nigeria, because of elections, we didn't hear any reaction, but I was speaking to one professor earlier today who was saying South Africa currently is facing challenges. The president, the head of state, the commander-in-chief is dealing with lots of things. And therefore, at some point in time, we are kind of veering off the road or forgetting to do some of the important tasks. For example, the issue of cabinet. We don't have clear indication when is he going to implement those changes. And now that you know that there are going to be changes within the cabinet, everybody's watching, and it's a wait and see. Even investors are not sure what's happening. So that uncertainty is also causing a problem for those who are watching us. And as I pointed out, the president right now being the chair of the Peace and Security Council in the AU, everybody wants a direction in terms of peace and stability because it does contribute to better economic development. And I think it's another issue that the president will have to look at so that he can also look at what's happening outside the borders.
Speaking of stability and security, as we move from intercontinental issues, even domestic issues, I mean, macroeconomics points to, the war. The shift in geopolitics is happening. The Russia-Ukraine war 1 year on. One is the question, is there hope that this war is going to end? What's also emerged 1 year later?
Well, as I pointed out, again, I want to go back to President Ramaphosa. All eyes on him. You know that South Africa has always been under pressure in terms of our position on the war in Ukraine or in relation to the war in Ukraine. We saw this week at the General Assembly again, we abstained, and other countries as well on the continent. And therefore, there's so much pressure on South Africa to play a role in assisting that this war does end. And there was a glimmer of hope yesterday when it was announced that the president of China, Xi Jinping, has presented what we call 7-point plan, peace plan, in terms of what can be used as a guide to bringing together Putin and Zelensky. Last night, Zelensky pointed out that he's willing to look at this document, but this morning he's singing a different tune. You know, he's also under pressure from the North or the developed North or the Western powers not to agree to everything, particularly because, United States of America and China currently, they are engaged in a Cold War, trade Cold War. And therefore, the relationship also between China and Russia. And therefore, we don't know. This is the proposal from the second largest economy in the world, and South Africa clearly with the relations with China and Russia, I think they will support Xi Jinping. The question is, President Ramaphosa at this moment also can play an important role to try and find a way to communicate with Joe Biden, the US, Xi Jinping, and Putin, and other countries as well who have different relationship with all stakeholders in that conflict to try and push that there are discussions. We'll see what's likely to happen, whether this 7-point plan peace document finally it will be adopted by stakeholders, or they'll find a way to make amendments so that everybody is on board. But I don't know. This war has affected the world so much economically and politically, and now we see those changes that we are talking about.
Lots more questions. I just think just before we wrap up, the last issue was the PEPFAR program launched 20 years ago by former U.S. President George W. Bush. Yesterday, it was celebrating countries, and the U.S., obviously, where the program has helped millions over the years. And I wonder how you'd weigh in on what the latest is against the fight against HIV and AIDS in South Africa and the continent, the world over, in fact.
Well, PEPFAR, an important program that was introduced by the President of the United States of America in 2003, W. Bush, under the Republicans. And at the time, former President Thabo Mbeki was the president. And South Africa is one of the countries that benefited in terms of this program. And therefore, 20 years on, a lot has been done. Today, we do talk about HIV and AIDS, but it's not a horror movie as it was when it started, like COVID-19, but it is still there. It was interesting when I was speaking to the ambassador of PEPFAR, who was appointed by Biden, Dr. John Kenkasong, who was the CDC director, you know him in Africa, saying that actually when you look at the death toll in terms of or people who have passed on around the globe, HIV and AIDS is still a leading cause of many deaths, and therefore it even beats the COVID-19 that we thought was horrible. And therefore it is still a problem. It's just that people live longer, people are more active because of treatment. But the main concern right now is that the young population is affected, and therefore particularly on the continent, the stats around the world 60% of those who are young people are from the African continent or the sub-Sahara region, and therefore a fight must continue. But it was also touching to hear Sir Elton John, you know him, a prominent international musician, talking about his wish. I mean, dead wish. Get it right, dead wish. Let's take a listen.
All right.
My dying wish is for this disease to be finished by 2030, so we can all lead. Every mother, every person that's living can live an AIDS-free life. That is what I started when we started our foundation. That was my goal. I never thought it would be as advanced as it is now, but we are advanced, but we have 10 years in which to do this, or no, 7 years to do it. So we got to do it, and we will.
A dying wish, that's Sir Elton John. I think this has hawked the headlines around the world. I think that was powerful, and I think the challenge is still with us, not only in South Africa, you know, on the continent, we are number one.
Thank you very much for weighing in on some of those top stories making headlines, some of which we're going to continue to monitor throughout the weekend. Sophie Mugwena's SABC International News Editor, just highlighting the international news for the week. So moving from the international front, we're going to come back home, look at some of the domestic issues. Of the 9 provinces, 7 has delivered their State of the Province address. Northwest State of the Province address chaos erupted. This obviously comes after the Economic Freedom Fighters members were demanding an apology from Premier Bushimape after the remarks he made during the State of the Nation address in Cape Town just last week. So perhaps to take a look at this and other stories making headlines, we're joined by Sanda Nkhoasheng, political analyst. Sanda, good afternoon. Thank you for your time here on the SABC.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
All right, so this week we saw about 6 provinces holding the State of the Nation address, State of the Province address rather. The Free State, the Northern Cape are the 2 provinces that are yet to host their State of the Province address. And I wonder if we can just get into some of the dynamics that erupted. Chaos having erupted, the strategy employed by the opposition, are these tactics enough? Walk us through what you observed on that front this week.
I mean, I think that, we have opposition parties that have stopped, trying to use much more strategic actions to get what they want. And now it's basically become a grab attention whichever way you can. And so that's why we've seen, the drama that we've seen across the different state of the province. I think that, we do this thing in South Africa where a lot of people focus only on the national state of the nation, and then everybody kind of is not so interested in the provincial state of the nation. And so opposition parties are doing their best to try and get people's attention by making sure that there's more to the conversation than just what was said. And I think, it's sad to me that opposition parties continue to rather use cheap politicking tricks instead of actually delivering, and using both the legislature as well as the courts and other implements that they have at their disposal in order to bring about change, in order to challenge the ruling party and also to challenge the executive.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about beyond the gimmicks and the tricks that were employed, let's get into what transpired, what was said. Gauteng, the Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, KZN, with the State of the Provinces having taken place, was there anything significant that came out? I mean, the issue of tackling crime, tackling triple threats seemed to top the list yet again.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the state of the nation sets the tone, and then the provincial states of the nation then follow on the tone that's set by the state, the national state of the nation. And I think we're seeing more and more, these provinces feeling as if they don't have as much heat on them, as I said, because there's just so much going on nationally. And I'm one that watches particularly the rural provinces of South Africa, which are Limpopo, KZN, and Eastern Cape. And every single year they make the same promises, and every single year they fail to deliver on these provinces. And it's quite scary to think that we live in a South Africa where 60% plus of children are living in poverty. We particularly have a serious issue in the Eastern Cape, where there is high unemployment in most of rural Eastern Cape and KZN and Limpopo. There are issues around health access, with not enough people being able to get ambulances when they need them, because of a lack of infrastructure development and infrastructure investment. The roads themselves are not able to allow for ambulances and other services that people need. I mean, people in rural areas are still struggling with basics like being able to get an ID card on time and being able to therefore access grant for children and for elderly people. And these are problems that we shouldn't even be discussing or talking about, but here we are still discussing them. And of course, we know that, we've done 10 steps forward and 10 steps back, in that rural areas were electrified, but now they also are suffering from the brunt of the load shedding that's happening. We know that it's mostly townships and rural areas that get the most of the load shedding. And so you have people who used to have ways of survival before electrification who are now being forced to go back to those ways, except the infrastructure that was built around, these non-electrified systems and solutions it no longer exists, and people don't have money in the same way that people have in urban areas. And so it's having an even more devastating effect on rural communities than we've seen in urban communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking about taking, steps forward and back, the electoral amendment bill has now come into the spotlight once again. Parliament finally having passed the bill. And I wonder what your thoughts are. The president has now yet to sign it into law, paving the way forward, obviously, for independent candidates to contest come next year's elections. What do you think we can expect on that front going forward, and also how this is going to impact 2024 and beyond?
I think it's good that, we have independent candidates who are going to be able to contest at national and provincial level, much as they have been contesting at a local level.
Yeah.
I do think, however, that it would have been great if, what people were fighting for, which is constitutional-based democracy rather than the party-less proportional representation system that we seem set to continue on. Because what we have right now is that we have politicians who are in power who have constituencies, but the people in those constituencies don't even know them. So people in areas don't always know who is representing them in Parliament. And once a year, Parliament makes a big show and all these politicians visit their constituencies. But outside of that, there really is very little work that these constitutional officers are doing, because these ministers are not, these politicians are not necessarily known in these areas, and there is very little by way of trying to hold these people accountable. And so I think that there should have been much more thought going into trying to develop a much more closer to constituency-based politics, because people want to be able to point a finger at the person that represents them, to challenge that person, and to hold them to account when they don't deliver, rather than having people who are hiding behind political parties. And even now that you're going to have independent candidates, because there isn't that direct link to constituency basis, it's going to be in some ways difficult to figure out who and where exactly the people who support this person that's an independent candidate are coming from. And what we've seen in the past as well is that a lot of even the independent candidates that are coming out are people who used to be, for example, with the ANC, had fights with the ANC, and then they left and basically used the popularity that they would have gained within the political party to then contest as independent candidates. So it's going to be interesting to see if we have true independent candidates, in the sense that people who are completely outside of the political system and we're not political party members who are going to be contesting, or if it's going to be yet another case of, well, it's just another option. If I don't come right at party level, I'll just contest, as an independent candidate. So we have to pay careful attention to how much accessibility this independent candidate allowing really gives in terms of people's options for people to vote for and people's options for people to hold accountable. Because the problem is not, whether people can vote for the people that they know or not. It's really, can we hold these people accountable, and what are the channels that are available? And the political party system has really disappointed in terms of helping us to have people be accountable for their negative actions and the impact that they have on people.
Because there's a lot at stake. We've seen the ripple effects in South Africa to date. A story, in fact, that's caught our attention this week was the announcement of the outgoing Eskom CEO, Andre de Ruyter, with immediate effect. The damning allegations that came out, upon his exit during an interview, and perhaps also the implications thereof, the announcement of the acting CEO, questions about where to from here for the utility. What's also been reflected on that front?
Well, I think that, the president is going to have to announce the cabinet reshuffle, first of all, sooner rather than later. Yeah. Secondly, they're going to have to announce this minister of electricity as soon as possible, because now, I was listening as you were talking to Sophie about the uncertainty and the fact that, international and national markets just generally don't like uncertainty, and they see uncertainty as a lack of ability to make decisions rather than as careful consideration. And Cyril Ramaphosa is the king of uncertainty, and he keeps kind of delaying making important decisions at the best of times, and now we are at the worst of times. And I think the immediate removal of Andre de Ruyter doesn't surprise me, because there is an expectation that when one is a CEO, you're going to wait at least until your CEO tenureship is done before you start doing explosive interviews. And while I think it's good that we now know a little bit more than we knew, I also have questions around him and the fact that he sat in that position for as long as he sat in it. He accepted the salary for as long as he did, and he's only coming out now after having resigned after such a long time. I think everybody knew, even from before he was appointed, that Eskom was corrupt, and that it was the politicians at the top who were facilitating that corruption. That's not a new thing. And so I'm also interested to find out why he took so long and why he didn't outright, remove himself. Because that interview also, what I found lacking in it is that he didn't seem to have any sense of responsibility. Like, he didn't take responsibility for his own action and for his own participation in the ruse that South Africa essentially was part of, that we had a CEO and that the CEO was in power and able to make the decisions that as a country we needed him to make. And so I have a lot of criticism for him and his own integrity, really, because if he really had the kind of ethics that he says he has, he should be giving us back the money that we paid him for him to not do the job as he said he wasn't able to. But I also think it's sad that, we sit with politicians. I heard Philip Balula saying that the ANC is not corrupt. That's an outright lie. That's actually, undermining our intelligence. The ANC is corrupt, inherently corrupt, has been corrupt for many years, and continues to be corrupt. And for as long as we have an ANC that is corrupt at the helm of government, we are going to continue to face the problems that we're facing. And I think it's one of those situations where South Africa has to decide what kind of future it wants for itself. They could wait for 2024. They could even do it before and decide that, we don't want the ANC in power anymore because they are not serving us. And in fact, they are taking us to the opposite state of what we want to be. If you combine the fact that, we're already on junk status, rating agencies are already saying they might decrease our status even further. We've just been grey listed. We have an energy crisis that seems to be unending, according to the CEO, not likely to end. And now we've got about 8.5 billion that's about to come into the fiscus that ANC wolves are sitting ready to kind of take on and eat and make disappear, instead of actually implementing for the just transition and ensuring that people who have been living in coal mining communities are able to have economies that can sustain them long after coal has been scrapped as part of energy production measures.
Asanda, because obviously there are questions about the social contract that's not being adhered to from the current administration. And you speak about accountability, you speak about leadership. I have to conclude this conversation, but I really just want to end off on the announcement of the ANC's, NEC's subcommittees that were elected. Some say that it suggests they're mostly aligned to President Cyril Ramaphosa. They are his allies. And just on the back of what you've echoed, perhaps as we head into 2024, the necessary changes that also need to be made, is this inspiring enough? And really, what can we make out of that announcement as the country heads into these unprecedented times?
And I think that, the ANC is really, it's like the difference between Coca-Cola and Sprite. They may taste different, but it's still the same company. I mean, it's still the same company that makes it. And so it doesn't matter how many faces you change in the ANC. The structure of the ANC is what's inherently corrupt. And so you can move in and out of the actual, political party as many people as you want, but it's not going to change the situation because it is the structure that is rotten and that is corrupt to the core. And so what we actually need is that we need ANC to give back South Africa to South Africa. We need South Africans to get up and vote in 2024 in their numbers to ensure that we no longer have to have this chalice on our necks that is called the ANC, because they have shown us repeatedly over almost 30 years that they are not interested in governance, that they are not interested in a brighter future for South Africa, and that in fact at this point all they are doing is just creating more and more debt that our children and our children's children are going to have to pay for, while ensuring that we have to spend more and more money on solar panels. Next it'll be Jojo tanks because we're going to run out of water soon, and next it'll be something else, and we just cannot afford this kind of destruction of our country anymore. And we all as South Africans need to decide what kind of future we want and make sure that we make the right decision come 2024, because we can no longer dilly-dally when it comes to this one. We can no longer sit on the sidelines and kind of watch from a distance, because our mutual futures are under threat.
Sanda, thank you for those sentiments, and thank you for joining us here on the SABC. Sanda Hoasheng, political analyst, weighing in on some of the top political stories that have made headlines this week, perhaps also the implications from here into. Again, thank you to her for her time. So let's leave it there, take a quick ad break. There is more upon our return. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The Week in Review continues. So other news making headlines this week, perhaps just before we wrap up, Chief Justice Raymond Zondo says he will consider a recusal application if it is brought before the Constitutional Court with the review of the Section 89 Independent Panel report into Phala. President Cyril Ramaphosa recently filed papers in the Apex Court challenging the report that made adverse findings against him. It found that there were discrepancies in the president's account of the events that took place on his farm back in 2020, and that he has a case to answer to. Zondo delivered the annual judicial report for the 2021-2022 financial year at the Constitutional Court, and this is obviously a story we'll be unpacking throughout the day. So we'll leave it there for now. That's also where we're going to leave the Week in Review. Thank you for tuning in. Tomorrow we take a look at what's to come with the week ahead. Until then, take care. It is goodbye for now from myself and the rest of the team.